The kingdom did not fall in war, it fell in silence. The Alpha King was gone, betrayed by his own council, poisoned in his own throne room, and erased from history like he never existed. The pack believed he was dead, and so they began rewriting the kingdom. They called the weak useless. They threw the crippled Omega beyond the sacred border, into the frozen wilderness where no wolf survives. She was supposed to die there, but in the snow, something impossible happened. 4 royal wolves emerged from the forbidden forest, creatures that only obey one name, the true Alpha King. And instead of killing her, they bowed. Far beneath the kingdom, in a place sealed for centuries, the Alpha King opened his eyes for the first time in months. Because for the first time, something had broken through his silence. A broken Omega. A girl who should not exist in his world. But the moment his wolves escorted her into the forbidden sanctuary, everything changed. The kingdom above continues to celebrate his death, while beneath them, the real Alpha King is waking up. And this time, he is not returning to rule. He is returning to end everything. The only question is, how did a crippled Omega become the key to the fall of an entire empire? The frozen river screamed before the sky did. Ice cracked like broken bones stretching across a dying world, splitting the northern valley into jagged pieces of white chaos. Wind howled through the shattered landscape, as if the kingdom itself was mourning something it had not yet understood. Beneath the collapsing surface of the water, massive shadows moved violently, trapped and suffocating under the crushing weight of freezing death. 12 giant wolves of the Royal Alpha Legion were drowning slowly, their bodies dragging under the ice, claws scraping helplessly against invisible walls of solid water. Each movement sent shockwaves through the river, but none were strong enough to break the prison that had swallowed them. Above the chaos, armored warriors stood frozen in hesitation. Not from fear of the wolves, but from the silence of command that had betrayed them. The royal escort had been attacked from within. No enemy banner had crossed the border. No rival army had been seen approaching. The destruction had come from trusted hands. That realization hung heavier than the freezing air itself. Somewhere behind the lines, the Alpha King was supposed to be protected. Instead, his presence had vanished from the battlefield like a ghost swallowed by betrayal. Deep inside the collapsing river system, one of the wolves let out a low, broken sound that barely reached the surface. It was not just pain. It was recognition of death approaching without mercy. The ice above it pulsed with cracks widening like veins of a dying beast. The water beneath churned violently, pulling everything downward into darkness. The wolves were not ordinary creatures. They were extensions of the Alpha King's will, bound to his presence, trained to move like living shadows of his authority. And now they were being erased one by one. Far away from the political collapse and hidden treachery, the edge of the frozen forest remained untouched by war. There, a young woman moved through the snow with quiet urgency. Her hands were red from cold, her breath visible in slow trembling waves, but her steps never hesitated. She was known only to the small settlements scattered along the northern wilderness, a figure of compassion where survival usually erased mercy. She had no army, no protection, no title that the world would respect. Yet she moved toward the sound of destruction, as if something inside her refused to accept silence as an answer. When she reached the river, she stopped. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood instinctively that what she was seeing was not natural disaster. It was engineered collapse. The ice was breaking in controlled patterns. The water currents were forced, directed. Something had been trapped below on purpose. Her eyes followed the shifting cracks until she saw movement beneath the surface. Massive shapes twisting, struggling, fading. Without waiting for understanding to form fully in her mind, she stepped onto the ice. It groaned under her weight, warning her with deep cracking sounds that echoed across the valley. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn back. But something deeper pulled her forward, something that felt like recognition without memory. The first wolf broke through the ice near her feet, half conscious, its body dragged upward by sheer force of desperation. Its fur was soaked, its breathing unstable, its eyes flickering between life and collapse. She did not hesitate. She grabbed its massive shoulder and pulled with all her strength. The ice resisted like a living enemy. Her hands slipped, her knees sank into freezing water, but she refused to let go. With one final pull, The wolf collapsed onto the surface, gasping violently as air returned to its lungs. One by one, she began to pull them out. Each rescue drained something from her body. Each wolf was heavier than the last, not just in weight but in presence. They were not ordinary beasts. There was an unnatural intensity in their aura, as if each one carried fragments of a greater will. The ice beneath her fractured further with every movement. Time itself felt unstable in that place, stretched between survival and collapse. Far above, hidden watchers observed from the edge of the treeline. They did not intervene. They did not reveal themselves. Their armor was marked with symbols of the new regime that had already begun to rise in the capital. They were not here to save anyone. They were here to ensure nothing survived that could challenge the new order. Their attention sharpened as they saw the woman pulling out the wolves. Not because she was helping them, but because she was interfering with something they had already decided should end. As the ninth wolf was dragged from the ice, the wind shifted. A deep pressure rolled across the valley, subtle but undeniable. The remaining wolves beneath the water began to react differently, not with panic, but with awareness. As if something inside them had changed. The woman felt it too. A weight in the air that pressed against her chest, making every breath slightly harder. The final wolf beneath the ice was still unconscious, but something about its presence was different from the others. The water around it was darker, denser, almost unwilling to release it. She knelt at the edge of the broken ice and looked down. For the first time, hesitation entered her movement. The shape beneath the surface was larger than the rest. Its presence was not just physical but symbolic, like the river itself was resisting its removal. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the freezing water again. The cold bit into her skin with unnatural force, as if the water was trying to reject her entirely. She wrapped her arms around the massive form and pulled. The moment she touched it, something strange happened. A pulse. Not from the river. From the wolf itself. A deep, faint reaction that echoed through her body, like a memory she had never lived. Her breath caught, but she forced herself forward. The ice cracked violently around them, the pressure increasing as if the world itself was collapsing inward to stop her. With one final desperate motion, she dragged the wolf onto the surface. It lay still, too still. The others had moved. This one did not. She leaned closer, checking for breath, unaware that she was now kneeling beside something the entire kingdom believed was already gone. The Alpha King had been declared dead in the capital days ago. A betrayal had erased his existence from official record. His throne had already been claimed by those who stood closest to him. But here, beneath frozen wind and shattered ice, the truth had not died. It was breathing quietly beneath a wolf's body. And as the woman placed her hands on his chest to feel for life, the world around her seemed to pause for the first time since the river began to break. Far away in the capital, the new Alpha throne was being raised. And in that exact moment, the last surviving wolf opened its eyes, not as an animal, but as something far more dangerous, remembering it had once been a king. The ice beneath the woman's knees cracked one final time, deeper than before, as if answering a name no one had spoken aloud yet. The night did not feel like night anymore. It felt like something heavier had settled over the world, as if the sky itself had lowered its head in silence. Deep inside the frozen forest, the wind no longer moved freely. It pressed against the trees like an invisible force trying to listen to something buried beneath the earth. Somewhere far from the broken river, life had begun again in silence, but it was not the same life that had existed before the ice collapsed. The young woman moved through the snow with exhausted steps, carrying the weight of survival she did not fully understand. Behind her, the rescued wolves followed, without sound, not as animals driven by instinct, but as beings drawn to something deeper in her presence. Their eyes never left the unconscious final wolf she had dragged from the frozen river. It lay on a wooden sled made from broken forest branches, its massive body still unmoving, still resisting the idea of returning to life. She had not spoken since leaving the river, not because there was nothing to say, but because every breath felt heavier than the last. Something about the final wolf stayed inside her mind like a shadow she could not shake. The moment she touched it, the world had reacted. A pulse she could not explain had passed through her body, leaving behind a strange emptiness, as if part of her awareness had been momentarily pulled into something else. The forest village appeared slowly through the falling snow. Small wooden shelters, half buried in white silence, barely held against the northern cold. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys like fading signals of survival. People inside those homes lived unaware of the storm that had just passed beyond the river. To them, the world remained simple. Life, hunger, survival. Nothing beyond that. But the woman knew something had changed. She brought the sled to the edge of the settlement and stopped. The wolves did not move forward immediately. They watched the village with caution, as if they were entering a place that did not belong to them anymore. The final wolf remained still, its chest barely rising, its presence heavy in a way that did not match its condition. Even unconscious, it felt like something that should not be placed on the ground of ordinary lives. An old healer from the village approached slowly, noticing the massive shapes behind her. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he saw the injured wolves. "This is dangerous," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of fear more than authority. "These are not normal beasts. You should not have brought them here." The woman did not respond immediately. Her hands were still trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper she could not name. She looked at the final wolf again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something beneath its fur. "I did not choose this," she finally said. "It was already happening when I found them." The healer stepped closer, studying the unconscious creature. The others reacted instantly, shifting their positions between him and the wolf as if protecting it without instruction. That reaction alone made the old man step back. "These are not wild animals," he whispered. "They are bound. I can feel it." The woman did not understand what he meant, but she felt the truth in his words anyway. There was something unnatural in the silence of the final wolf. Not emptiness, but controlled absence. As if its presence had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of existence. Inside the village, word spread quickly. Strangers bringing massive wolves into a settlement was not something that could remain unnoticed. People gathered at a distance, watching from behind wooden walls and half-closed doors. Fear and curiosity moved together through the crowd, but no one dared approach too closely. The woman placed the sled near a fire pit outside the healer's shelter. Warm light flickered across the snow, revealing the deep injuries of the wolves more clearly. The others had begun to recover slowly, their breathing steadier, their bodies reacting to warmth. But the final wolf remained unchanged. It did not respond to heat. It did not respond to movement. It did not respond to life. Only silence surrounded it, deeper than anything she had ever seen. As night deepened, the village settled into uneasy stillness. The wolves lay close together, forming a protective circle around the unconscious one. The woman sat nearby, watching without realizing she had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment the river cracked open. Not the destruction, but the feeling beneath it. A presence that had reacted to her touch. Hours passed before the first sign appeared. A faint shift in the final wolf's breathing. So subtle that she almost missed it. Then another. The air around it grew heavier, not physically, but emotionally. The kind of pressure that made thoughts slow down without explanation. The wolves around it lifted their heads at the same time, sensing the change before anyone else could. The woman leaned forward slightly. Something was happening. The healer, who had been observing from a distance, froze as he noticed the change as well. His expression darkened with something close to recognition, though he could not explain why. "This should not be possible," he muttered. "Not after what it endured." The final wolf's chest rose again, this time more firmly. A slow return to breath that did not feel natural, but deliberate, as if something inside it had chosen to begin again. The woman moved closer without thinking. Her hand hovered above its fur, uncertain whether to touch it again. The moment she did, the reaction returned. That same pulse from the river, weaker now, but undeniable. It traveled through her arm, up her spine, and settled somewhere deep in her awareness. Her breath stopped. This time she saw something. Not a vision, not a memory, but a feeling of a vast space collapsing inward. A throne made of silence. A voice that had never been spoken but had always commanded. And beneath it all, a presence that refused to disappear even after being erased. She pulled her hand back quickly, shaken. The wolves around her stood up. Not aggressively, but in recognition. The healer stepped forward now, his fear replaced by something sharper. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "it is not what it appears to be." At that exact moment, the final wolf moved. Not fully awake, but enough. Its claws pressed slightly into the ground beneath it. Snow around its body trembled, as if responding to pressure that came from within rather than outside. Its head tilted faintly, struggling against unconsciousness, but not in weakness, in resistance. And then, for the first time since the river collapse, its eyes opened halfway. Not looking at the woman, not looking at the village, but staring into something far beyond it. The entire group froze, because in that single half-open gaze, there was no animal left. Only something buried beneath identity, struggling to return. Far away in the capital, unseen by anyone in the village, banners rose above the palace walls announcing a new alpha authority. And at the exact same moment, the final wolf finally inhaled fully for the first time, not as a survivor, but as something remembering it had once ruled death itself. And the woman realized too late that she had not saved a wolf from the river. She had pulled something back into the world that the entire kingdom had already decided should never return. The snow outside the village began to fall harder, as if the sky itself had recognized the beginning of something it could no longer prevent. The silence inside the forest broke like a living thing snapping under pressure. Snow stopped falling for a moment, as if even the sky had paused to witness what was emerging from beneath forgotten death. Inside the small village, every breath felt heavier, every sound sharper. The final wolf no longer lay like a broken creature. Its body had changed in subtle but terrifying ways. Not in shape but in presence. The air around it felt compressed, as though reality itself was adjusting to something returning that had once been removed from it. The young woman stood motionless beside the fire pit, her eyes fixed on the creature that had already begun to defy explanation. The wolves around it no longer behaved like rescued animals. They stood in alignment, not by instinct but by recognition. Something inside them had awakened at the same rhythm, a shared awareness that had nothing to do with survival anymore. It was obedience returning to its source. The healer had stepped back completely now. His face had lost all color. Years of living in isolation, studying wounds and survival, had never prepared him for something that felt like authority without movement. "This is not recovery," he whispered. "This is return." The woman did not respond. Her mind was still trapped in the memory of the river, in that strange pulse that had passed through her body the moment she touched the final wolf. She had tried to ignore it, tried to explain it as shock or exhaustion. But it was no longer something she could dismiss. Something inside her had changed the moment she pulled it from the water. The final wolf shifted again. This time, the movement was not uncertain. It was controlled. Its claws pressed into the snow and pushed slightly forward. The motion was small, but it carried weight that made the surrounding air feel unstable. The wolves around it lowered their heads slowly, not in fear, but in alignment. The village, which had been whispering moments earlier, fell into complete silence. The healer moved closer again, despite his fear. "There are old stories," he said carefully. "Stories buried under northern winters. They speak of wolves that are not wolves. They speak of bodies used as vessels when kings are erased from existence. But those are stories meant to scare children." His voice faltered as the final wolf lifted its head slightly higher. The woman stepped forward without thinking. Something about it was pulling her closer again, the same force she had felt at the river. Not physical attraction, but something deeper. A recognition she could not place. Her instincts warned her to stop, but her body ignored them. The final wolf opened its eyes fully, and everything changed. The moment its gaze settled into the world, the atmosphere inside the village collapsed inward. Not violently, but completely. The wolves around it lowered themselves further, as if responding to something absolute. The healer stumbled backward, unable to maintain balance under the pressure of presence alone. The woman froze, because those eyes were not empty. They were aware, not of the village, not of her, but of something far beyond all of it, as if consciousness had returned from a place that normal thought could not follow. A low breath escaped the creature's throat, deeper than anything an animal should have been capable of producing. The sound carried through the snow, and settled into every corner of the settlement like a command that did not need words. The woman felt it again, that pulse, but stronger now. It did not just pass through her body this time. It aligned with it. Her breathing slowed without intention. Her thoughts sharpened without effort. Something inside her mind briefly touched a structure that did not belong to her, and then withdrew before she could understand it. The final wolf rose halfway from the ground. Snow fell from its fur like fragments of a broken illusion. The movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply unnatural in its control. It did not look like recovery. It looked like reconstruction. The healer whispered something under his breath, but no one heard him clearly. His voice was lost under the weight of realization forming too slowly in his mind. The wolves around the final one suddenly shifted again. Their alignment changed from submission to formation. Not random movement, but organized positioning, as if responding to invisible command lines that had suddenly become active again after being dormant for too long. The woman stepped back instinctively. The fire behind her flickered violently, even though no wind had moved through the village. The final wolf turned its head slightly toward her and paused. For the first time, its gaze focused on something specific. Her. The connection was not emotional. It was not familiar in a human sense. It was recognition at a level deeper than identity. Something inside it acknowledged her presence not as rescuer or stranger, but as the point through which return had become possible. The woman's breath became uneven. Her chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from pressure she could not explain. Her knees weakened slightly, as if the ground beneath her was no longer fully stable. The healer finally spoke, voice trembling. "Step away." But she could not move. The final wolf stood fully now. Its body was no longer collapsing under injury or exhaustion. It stood as something reassembled, something that had reclaimed structure after being dissolved. The surrounding wolves lowered themselves completely, their heads touching the snow, forming a silent circle of submission. The village itself felt smaller now, not physically but in presence, as if something had expanded within it that made everything else feel secondary. The final wolf took one slow step forward. The snow beneath its paw did not break. It held, as if the ground itself had decided not to resist it anymore. The woman's mind flashed briefly with fragments she did not understand. A throne without shape. A river of frozen silence. A voice that had once commanded armies without needing sound. She could not hold the images long enough to interpret them, but they left behind emotional weight that made her chest ache. The final wolf stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel its breath. But instead of hostility, there was stillness. Deep, controlled stillness. Then something impossible happened. The wolf's eyes shifted slightly, not away from her, but through her, as if looking beyond the physical world she occupied. The healer dropped to one knee without realizing it. The villagers watching from afar began to retreat instinctively, unable to explain the fear rising in them. And then the final wolf exhaled slowly. The sound was not loud, but it carried meaning. The woman's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. When it cleared, something had changed again. Not in the world, but in perception. She suddenly understood that what stood before her was not simply recovering. It was remembering. And memory in something like this was not passive. It was return of authority. The final wolf tilted its head slightly, as if testing the boundary between past and present. The wolves around it remained frozen in submission. Even the wind outside the village slowed, as if waiting for direction. The healer's voice broke the silence again, weaker now. Whatever this is, it is not finished waking up. The woman felt her hands tremble, because she realized something she had not been willing to consider until now. If this was not finished waking up, then what she had pulled from the river was not a survivor. It was something paused, something waiting, something that had not yet decided what it would become again. The final wolf's gaze sharpened slightly, and in that moment, far beyond the forest, in the distant capital where a false throne had already been raised, the newly crowned rulers suddenly felt a shift they could not explain. As if something they believed was gone had just opened its eyes again. And the woman standing in the snow realized the truth too late. She had not rescued a dying creature. She had restarted something the entire kingdom had already tried to erase. The final wolf took another step forward, and the air itself seemed to wait for what it would become next. The capital burned in silence before it burned in fire. Not real fire at first, but the fire of authority collapsing into chaos. The banners of the new regime had already been raised across the highest towers, yet something beneath them was beginning to rot. Guards moved through the palace corridors with forced confidence, but their footsteps no longer carried certainty. Every sound inside the royal structure felt slightly delayed, as if the building itself was reacting too slowly to something it could not yet see. At the center of the throne hall, the new Alpha ruler sat beneath a crown that did not feel like his own. It had been placed on his head by advisors who spoke too quickly and smiled too carefully. The throne had once belonged to a king who ruled without hesitation. Now it belonged to men who ruled through fear of absence rather than strength of presence. But something was wrong. It began as a feeling, a pressure in the air that did not belong to the room. The advisors noticed it first, though none of them spoke about it. Their eyes drifted toward the tall windows of the hall, where the frozen horizon of the north stretched endlessly. The same horizon where the old king had supposedly died. The same horizon they had stopped thinking about too quickly. Then the guards outside the palace gates began to report disturbances. Not invasions. Not armies. Something worse. Silence moving against them. In the frozen forest far from the capital, the transformation had already begun. The final wolf stood motionless in the snow, but the world around it no longer treated it like a creature. The air itself felt structured around its presence. The woman stood several steps away now, her body tense, her instincts torn between stepping forward and running. The healer had retreated completely, unable to maintain composure under what he could no longer rationalize. The wolves that had been rescued no longer behaved like wounded animals. They had formed a silent perimeter, not as protection, but as recognition. As if something ancient had been restored in front of them, and they had remembered their place within it. The final wolf took another step forward. The snow did not resist. The woman's breath tightened as she felt the pressure in the air increase again. It was not physical weight. It was something closer to authority returning layer by layer into the world. Every instinct she had told her to step back, but something deeper prevented her from moving. The wolf stopped directly in front of her again, this time closer, and then it lowered its head slightly, not in submission, not in weakness, but in recognition of alignment. The woman's mind fractured briefly under the sensation. She saw flashes again, not visions she could control, but impressions that did not belong to human understanding. A battlefield covered in silence. A river breaking under impossible weight. A throne room filled with people kneeling without being ordered. Her knees weakened slightly. The healer finally spoke, his voice trembling. It is not becoming a wolf anymore. The woman did not respond, because she already knew. Something inside it was reorganizing itself beyond physical form. The presence she felt was no longer fragmented. It was stabilizing. The final wolf lifted its head again, and the air changed completely. The wolves behind it all lowered themselves at once. Not in reaction, in synchronization. The village beyond the clearing began to feel it too. Doors slowly opened. People stepped outside, without understanding why. Something in their bodies responded before their minds could interpret it. A presence that demanded awareness. The final wolf took one slow breath, and when it exhaled, something invisible spread outward through the forest. The woman felt it pass through her again, but this time it did not leave confusion. It left certainty. Her eyes widened slightly as realization formed fully. This was not a recovery. This was activation. Far away, in the capital, the reaction began instantly. The throne room lights flickered once. Not from wind. From imbalance. The advisors turned toward each other, sensing something shift in the foundation of their control. The crowned ruler stood slightly, his expression tightening as a strange pressure entered the hall. Outside the palace, guards froze mid-movement, because from the northern horizon, something was coming that could not be measured in distance or time. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to change again. Not physically in a visible way at first, but in the way it occupied space. The air around it felt denser. The silence around it felt controlled rather than empty. Even the wind seemed to adjust its path subtly around its presence. The woman stepped back one more time, finally breaking the paralysis. But she was too late to escape what was already unfolding. The final wolf's eyes closed, and for a brief moment, absolute stillness covered everything. The forest, the village, the capital far away, even the wind itself seemed to pause. Then it opened its eyes again. And the world responded. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. The pressure that had been building since the river collapsed finally reached its peak. The final wolf no longer looked like a recovering creature. It looked like something returning to its rightful state. The healer fell to his knees without understanding why. The woman's breath became shallow as she felt the truth settle fully into her awareness. This was not just a surviving beast. This was a command structure reassembling itself. And she had been standing too close to it the entire time. The final wolf turned its head slightly. And for the first time, it looked past her completely. As if something else had arrived. Something that did not belong to the forest. The woman followed its gaze instinctively. And that was when she felt it too. Not sound. Not sight, but presence. Something approaching from far beyond the village. Something that made the air itself feel like it was preparing for judgment. The wolves around her stood again in perfect alignment. The healer whispered, barely audible. It is not just waking. It is being followed. The woman's heart tightened, because she understood what that meant without needing explanation. Whatever she had pulled from the river was not isolated. It was connected to something larger. Something that had already started moving before she even realized it existed. The final wolf took one step forward again. And this time the ground beneath it responded. Snow shifted outward in a perfect circle, as if the world itself had acknowledged its return. And then, for the first time since the river, a sound broke through the silence. Not from the wolf, not from the forest, but from the distant direction of the capital. A signal horn, followed by another, and another. The woman turned sharply toward the sound. The healer's face went pale, because those horns were not warnings. They were recognition signals used only when something classified as impossible had been detected approaching the kingdom. The final wolf stood still, and in that stillness, something inside it finally aligned completely. The woman felt it before she understood it. A shift, not in emotion, not in behavior, but in identity. And then the final wolf took one last step forward. Its presence expanded silently across the forest, across the snow, across distance itself. And the woman realized the truth with a cold clarity that made her chest tighten. She had not saved the last wolf. She had brought back something the entire kingdom had already declared dead. And somewhere far away, the throne that had been stolen began to feel something it had never been designed to withstand. The gates of the capital trembled before they even opened. Not from siege engines, not from armies, but from something far more unsettling. The guards stationed at the outer walls felt it first, a pressure in the air that did not belong to weather or war. The snow beyond the horizon had begun to fall differently, as if even nature was adjusting its rhythm to something approaching from beyond comprehension. Inside the palace, the false alpha ruler stood again, his crown suddenly heavier than it had been moments before. The throne room no longer felt stable. Conversations among advisors slowed, then stopped entirely. Every instinct inside them began to warn of something they could not yet name. Then the first report arrived. The northern forests had gone silent. Completely. No movement. No wildlife. No wind patterns behaving naturally. As if something had passed through and taken control of even silence itself. The false ruler ordered denial before fear could take shape, but his voice did not carry authority anymore. It carried uncertainty. And uncertainty was something the capital had not experienced since the original Alpha King had vanished. Far beyond the walls, in the frozen wilderness, the woman stood frozen in place. The final wolf no longer looked like a creature bound to the earth. It stood as if the world itself had adjusted its rules around its existence. The wolves that once followed instinct now stood in formation, not as animals, but as extensions of something larger returning to awareness. The healer had already retreated into silence, unable to reconcile what he was witnessing. His entire understanding of life, healing, and nature had collapsed under the weight of something that should not exist. The woman's breathing was shallow. Every instinct in her body screamed that she was standing too close to something she could not survive if it fully awakened. Yet she did not move. Something inside her refused to retreat, as if her own existence had become tied to what was unfolding before her. The final wolf took one step forward, and the snow beneath it responded like it had been waiting, not breaking, not resisting, just accepting. The air grew heavier again. Not physically, but in a way that made thought itself feel slower. The woman's vision sharpened painfully, every detail becoming more defined as if reality itself was preparing to record what was about to happen. The wolf stopped and lifted its head toward the distant horizon. The capital. The woman followed its gaze and felt it too. Not sight, not sound, presence. A force moving across the land, like a memory returning to something that had forgotten it once belonged to it. The healer whispered weakly, "It is not here. It is coming." The woman's heart tightened because she finally understood the scale of what she had triggered. This was no longer about survival or recovery. It was about convergence. Something had begun in the river, passed through the forest, and was now reaching outward into the world itself. The final wolf closed its eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, everything changed. The capital's gates slammed shut on their own. Not by command, by reaction. Inside the throne room, the false ruler stepped back as the massive doors of the palace began to tremble. The advisors finally lost all composure, moving toward exits that no longer felt safe. The guards outside the throne room tightened their grip on weapons they suddenly did not believe would be enough. Then it arrived. Not physically at first, but in awareness. A pressure so complete it felt like identity itself was being evaluated by something older than authority. The false alpha ruler's crown slipped slightly, just enough to make him realize he was no longer the center of anything. And then the doors opened. Slowly. Not broken. Not forced. Just opened. As if the structure itself had decided resistance was no longer relevant. A wind passed through the throne hall, but it was not wind. It carried memory, and with it, recognition. Every guard inside the hall froze as their bodies responded before their minds could process what they were seeing. At the entrance stood a figure, not fully defined at first, not fully human in presence, but undeniable in authority. The return had begun. Back in the forest, the final wolf opened its eyes again. But this time, there was no hesitation, no instability, only clarity. The woman felt her breath stop completely as she realized the alignment had finished. What stood before her was no longer a recovering creature. It was something reassembled, something restored. The wolves around it lowered their heads once more, but now the gesture carried finality instead of uncertainty. The healer collapsed fully to the ground, unable to remain standing under the pressure of what his mind could no longer process. The woman's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The final wolf did not respond in words. It did not need to, because the world itself began to respond for it. Far away, in the capital, the false ruler fell from his throne. Not from force, from recognition collapse. Because the presence now filling the throne room was no longer something he could pretend did not exist. The advisors backed away as the figure stepped forward. And with each step, the illusion of stolen authority fractured further. Outside the palace, the skies shifted. Snow began to fall in reverse motion for a brief moment, as if time itself had misaligned in confusion. Inside the throne room, the figure stopped at the base of the throne and lifted its gaze. The false ruler could not speak, could not command, could only understand that everything he had built was standing on borrowed absence. And absence had just ended. Back in the forest, the final wolf's body began to shift again. But this time, it was not transformation. It was revelation. The woman stumbled back as the air itself tightened, because she finally saw it, not through vision, not through memory, but through certainty that struck deeper than understanding. The presence she had been interacting with was not a beast, not a creature, not even a survivor. It was something that had been stripped of identity and forced into silence. And silence had finally ended. The final wolf took one step forward. And in that step, everything aligned. The capital, the forest, the river, the memory of betrayal, the collapse of a kingdom. All of it converged into a single returning truth. The woman fell to her knees without realizing why. Because her body understood before her mind accepted it. The final wolf was no longer just awakening. It was reclaiming. And somewhere far away, in the collapsing throne room, the false ruler finally heard it. Not sound, not voice, but identity returning to the world. The Alpha King had come back. And the kingdom that thought it had replaced him was about to learn what it meant to exist under the rule of something that had never truly left. The final wolf turned its gaze toward the woman one last time. And for the first time, there was no confusion in its eyes. Only certainty, as if it now remembered everything. And then, in the silence that followed, the air itself seemed to bow. But somewhere deep inside the returning presence, something even more dangerous began to surface. Not revenge, not anger, but judgment. And the woman realized, too late, that what she had saved from the river was not returning to be grateful. It was returning to decide what the world was still allowed to be. The snow fell harder over the forest. The world did not celebrate when the Alpha King returned. It trembled. The first sound was not war horns or royal proclamation. It was silence collapsing under its own weight. Inside the capital, the throne room no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like something hollow had been filled with something it could not contain. The false ruler lay beneath shattered steps of authority, his crown broken beside him, his ambition reduced to something small and unrecognizable. No one spoke, not because they were ordered to remain silent, but because speech itself felt unnecessary in the presence that now filled the hall. The Alpha King stood at the base of the throne, no longer in the form of a beast, no longer trapped between memory and instinct. The transformation was complete, but it was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, as if reality had corrected a mistake it had been carrying for too long. Every guard in the hall felt it at the same time. Their weapons lowered without command. Their bodies reacted before their minds could resist. The weight of presence alone was enough to dissolve resistance that had been built over years of fear and loyalty to false power. The Alpha King did not rush forward. He did not need to. The throne itself felt smaller as he approached it. Not physically, but in meaning. What once represented absolute authority now looked like something temporary, something borrowed, something that had been sitting in the dark, pretending to matter. He placed one hand on the arm of the throne, and for a brief moment, the entire structure of the capital reacted, not breaking, not collapsing, but acknowledging. The stone beneath the palace shifted slightly, like the kingdom itself was adjusting to the return of its original center. Outside, the skies above the capital changed color in a way no one could explain. Snow that had been falling for days began to move differently, slower, heavier, as if gravity itself had become uncertain. Inside the forest far away, the woman stood frozen. She had not followed the events of the capital physically, but she had felt them. Every shift, every collapse, every return. The final wolf no longer stood in front of her as a mystery. It stood as something complete. Its eyes were calm now, but not empty. They carried the stillness of something that had already finished becoming what it was meant to be. The wolves around it no longer moved. They simply existed in alignment, as if the forest itself had accepted a new order without resistance. The healer finally spoke, his voice weak and broken. "It is over." But the woman did not answer, because something inside her refused to accept that word. Over meant ending. And what she was sensing did not feel like an ending. It felt like conclusion. In the capital, the Alpha King finally turned away from the throne. Not because he rejected it, but because he no longer needed to question it. The advisors who had once controlled the false ruler now stood in complete silence. Some had already fallen to their knees without realizing it. Others simply stared, unable to process how quickly the structure of power had dissolved around them. The Alpha King moved forward through the hall. Each step did not demand obedience. It created it. The guards parted without instruction. The path opened without resistance. Not because fear controlled them, but because recognition had replaced confusion. Something inside them remembered what authority actually felt like, and everything false became unbearable in comparison. As he passed through the hall, fragments of the past began to settle into place within the kingdom's memory. Betrayal was no longer hidden. Lies no longer held structure. Every manipulation that had built the false regime began to collapse under its own exposure. But the Alpha King did not stop to punish anyone yet. His presence alone was enough to undo what had been constructed in his absence. Outside the palace gates, the city reacted in waves. People stepped into streets without understanding why they were drawn there. Something in the air had changed. Something that could not be explained but could not be ignored. The return had become undeniable. Back in the forest, the woman finally stepped closer to the final wolf. Her hand moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of understanding that whatever stood before her was no longer uncertain. The moment her fingers touched its fur again, there was no shock this time. No overwhelming pulse. Only recognition, not of the creature, but of the connection it carried. Her breath steadied slightly as she realized something that made her chest tighten in a different way. She had not just saved a life. She had anchored something that had been drifting between collapse and return. The final wolf closed its eyes. And in that moment, the distance between forest and capital disappeared completely in meaning. The Alpha King stood once more at the edge of the throne, and instead of sitting, he turned slightly toward the broken hall. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The words carried without sound breaking the air. Every lie ends where presence begins. The false authority of the capital did not respond. It simply ceased, like a structure that had realized it was no longer supported. Back in the forest, the woman suddenly felt a shift so deep it forced her to take a step back. The final wolf's body began to dissolve its remaining uncertainty, not physically but in presence, as if everything it had carried between survival and identity had finally chosen one form. The healer whispered again, but this time there was no fear in his voice. It is not a return anymore. It is completion. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she understood what that meant. The Alpha King was no longer divided between what he was and what he had become. He was now entirely himself, and that meant the world would no longer experience him as survival or a struggle, only as truth. In the capital, the Alpha King reached the edge of the palace balcony, overlooking the entire city. The wind moved around him, but did not touch him the same way it touched everything else. The world beneath him felt reorganized by presence alone. People looked up without being told, not out of fear, out of recognition they could not explain. The Alpha King stood at the highest point of the kingdom, and for the first time since his return, he allowed silence to stretch long enough for the entire world to feel it fully. Then he spoke once more, not as command, but as final alignment. What was stolen returns to structure. What was false returns to nothing. And the kingdom, for the first time, understood what it had truly been waiting for. Not a ruler, but correction. In the forest, the woman finally lowered her hand, and the final wolf opened its eyes one last time. This time, there was no separation between what it had been and what it was. Only clarity. The wind passed through the trees gently, as if the world had finally stopped resisting its own balance. And then, from the far distance, beyond forest, beyond capital, beyond every boundary the kingdom had known, a new sound began to form. Not war, not celebration, but expansion. As if something had awakened, not just within a kingdom, but within the world itself. The woman looked toward the horizon, her heart tightening again, because she realized something that had never been spoken aloud. The Alpha King's return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything that came after it. And far away, where the throne had once stood in broken silence, the Alpha King turned slightly toward the open horizon, as if sensing something beyond the kingdom itself had already begun to respond to his existence. Something larger, something waiting. And for the first time since returning, he did not look at what he had reclaimed.